have a very, very special program today, and we want to particularly allow the full time for this program. I know you're going to thoroughly enjoy it. So we are going to move directly to the program now, and General Peyton Cole will introduce our speaker.
Thank you. In the interest of brevity, I'll just go through a couple things that I think you ought to know about. My good friend, Major General Jim Graves, retired. If Louisiana had an aristocracy, then Jim would be a prince. And if he wants to go into that, I'll let him go into it. His father was a career Air Force officer. Jim graduated from William and Mary and came into the Air Force. And then later, about 8 to 10 years after that, he went to LSU. Finally got smart, huh? and he got a law degree. He went through pilot training at Williams Air Force Base, where all good Air Force, really good Air Force pilots go through. And he was a commander of the 47th Fighter Squadron. That was the only squadron that managed to get airplanes airborne at Pearl Harbor. And unfortunately, that squadron was deactivated yesterday when we lost our A-10s. Ian Britta, his wife, had 2 children. Ariane, his daughter, is 10. And Warren, their son, named after his father, is 8. So without further ado, Jim, call you.
Well, thank you, Pete. I rush to point out that I was not the commander of the 47th. At the time, those airplanes got airborne. And I also, in the interest of truth and advertising, for those that don't know me, I want to point out that when I attended that otherwise academically prestigious little institution in down East Virginia, William and Mary, that I personally paid a lot more attention to Mary than anything William had to say. Right? And during the time I got that law degree at LSU, it did not have its current strong status as a great sports school. Particularly, I remember fondly those 2004 and 2008 PSC championships. How about that? But it did have the well-deserved reputation. This was the team that I put my personal support behind as the #1 party school in the nation. And now for those that do know me, and particularly I see Judge Bryson over here, who have heard me speak before, you'll be able to identify them that they're the ones who brought a pillow. Okay, so with that, let me get on and talk about what I'm here to talk to you about, which is a underappreciated treasure that we have here in our community in Northwest Louisiana, that I hope you will appreciate more when I finish my remarks, and I hope that you will appreciate it enough to look at what we've scattered about on the tables in front of you that include membership applications. And that's how we can really show our appreciation. But this is it. Really? Edvard Grieg from Holberg's Time Morning? I don't know that I would have picked that music, but if you can see this magnificent collection of the actual aircraft that won the Second World War, the greatest air battles in human history, and prevailed in the Cold War, are collected, this being the airplane park, at the Barksdale Global Power Museum, recently rebranded from the 8th Air Force Museum so that it can have a broader portfolio. An FB-111. This is a B-58 rocket sled test device used at the Air Force Test Center. And of course the venerable C-47 and now B-17 Flying Fortress. There's the newly labeled Barksdale Global Power Museum. Ladies and gentlemen, right here in our community. That's interesting how I came to make this presentation and to get involved with the Barksdale Global Power Museum. About 8 years ago, I was at Pacific Air Force's headquarters. Get your napkins out, get ready to dab the tears for me. That would be on the island of Oahu, Hawaii, at Hickam Air Force Base. You know, war's hell, you just go where they send you, suck it up, don't complain. I was out there working for one of the greatest historians our Air Force has ever produced, General Paul Hester. And he wanted to, for a conference that he was having, an Air Force-wide conference that he was having out there at PACAF, as we called it, headquarters at Hickam, he wanted to put together something that would distill from the first century of America's air power the greatest lessons that we had to learn. And he put me in charge of that project and asked me to make that presentation. And he gave me, in addition to my own personal staff, he gave me the office of the command historian there at headquarters PACAF. They did actually some archaeological work under my direction to find some things that you'll see. He gave me his Commander's Action Group, or CAG, to do all the PowerPoint Ranger stuff that you see here. He also put me in touch with the Air Force Association Aerospace Education Foundation, and they gave me some resources that I could use. And what I'm going to ask you to do is that if you like what you see here, if you think particularly the PowerPoint Ranger tab should be buffed up and maybe get an oak leaf cluster, give credit to the CAG. If you like the history, give credit to the historian. If you like some of the videos, give credit to the Air Force Association. If you're mad about something, come see me, okay? But it does have an awful lot of lessons, and I did distill out 10. And when I presented it there, I couldn't help but compare that to the Letterman Top 10. So I used a Letterman Top 10 on the 10 top reasons to not want to serve in Alaska, where we had one of our major wings. But there's some other people who are particularly involved in this, and I want to introduce them as they go on. First, the handsome young airman shown there shaking hands with the guy in the blue uniform. Everybody have him? Okay, that is our Global Power Museum Association President, Mr. Terry Stook. Terry, stand up, please. Done a magnificent job of guiding us through this transition, this rebranding and broadening the portfolio out there. We're also blessed to have someone who is herself not a stranger to public speaking. A little quick on the trigger here. Our new museum director, Miss Amy Russell. Miss Amy Russell. Got a quick peek at our association vice president, himself not a stranger to public speaking, Mr. Phil Stewart. He's over here as the sound man for this presentation. Phil is what I call the vice president in charge of all things fun. He is the guy that sets up the golf tournaments that we have. He sets up the fundraisers. He sets up the distinguished speakers dinners. And now if you want all 10 lessons, you're going to have to come to a distinguished speaker dinner, because I'm only going to go through a few. I'm only going to go through a sampling of about 3, just to show you how these lessons from the first century of America's air and space power connect back to the little old pea patch airfield that's right across the river from us right here, Barksdale Air Force Base. It amazed me when I started pulling the strings on that. I think it would amaze all of us. And already introduced, no stranger to this group, from the South Shreveport Rotary Club, and also the treasurer of the Barksdale Global Power Museum Association, Ms. Linda Self. Okay, I also want to give credit to the people who are the real authors of these lessons, and you'll take a little walk down memory lane with me here as I go back and explain where these lessons evolved from. And to do that, you have to go back to 1928, the West Point class of 1928, where this cadet from Meridian, Mississippi, who looks like he's about 12 years old there in his senior yearbook photo, graduated and started a journey with his best friend. Well, here he is again. He's in flight school here. He looked respectable. He had a little bit more adult. He grew a mustache, but it's the same guy. He started on the road with his best friend, who also graduated in the class of 1928, and they passed by train through Meridian, Mississippi. where this guy introduced this guy to his sister. They fell in love, got married, and in recognition of their friendship and appreciation for a classmate and brother here, they named their first child in his honor. This guy, then while down in San Antonio, meets this Army widow, the widow of an Army cavalry officer who lost his life in a little combat action along the Rio Grande, probably more reminiscent of the 19th century than the 20th, possibly prescient of the 21st century, in a skirmish with some Mexican banditos who were coming across the unguarded border there. She had 3 beautiful daughters, 2 of whom are shown here, who were eager to recruit a new dad. And in one of the greatest recorded instances of military courage in our history, ladies and gentlemen, this guy right here signed up for the job, married her, and took on those 3 little girls. This guy, about this time, this would be in the mid-1930s, was a student at Centenary College. And he was involved with the ROTC program. It was something called the Civilian Flying Training Program, a Roosevelt-era initiative to produce future military pilots. And he met one of the instructors in that program, this guy, a lieutenant out at Barksdale Field. And, you know, those of you who are paying attention are going to see a trend here. This guy introduced this guy to his sister, and I think you know how this turns out. They fell in love. And in October 1936, their parents, that being the 2 on the right there, thought that she was too young to marry one of these flyboys from Barksdale and go off to God knows where. You know, they just send them everywhere. So they felt she was too young, so they refused to approve the marriage. But these 2 decided to get married secretly in October of 1936, and this guy right here was the witness on the marriage certificate. Now, you know, her parents forgave her. She was an innocent magnolia blossom from the South who just fell victim to the fast-talking ways of some Yankee carpetbagger. It couldn't be her fault. But the guy on the right, he was in real trouble. All right. So, this guy, well, he went on to become this guy. More on him later. This guy went on to become this guy, a World War II wing commander at the Pacific Theater. During the time he was out there, at one time or another, he had this guy, and you remember him, this guy, work for him at various times in various assignments across the Pacific Theater. Well, just to prove that chutzpah remains an Air Force Corps competency, when these 3 guys got home from the war, one by one, right under the boss's nose, remember those 3 little girls? They started taking them out, and they became an item, and they became an item, and wouldn't you know, they became an item. All right. Well, none of these guys, let me get back one more there. None of these guys ever became a Billy Mitchell or an Ira Eaker or an Arnold or a LeMay. But you know, they were one step removed from all of those leaders. This guy was out there in the Pacific with Doolittle. This guy is shown being awarded the Air Medal for action over Italy. And if you've ever been in an Army Officers Club, many of them have a little plaque up there that says, "No Air Force colonels under 21 served here." This guy is the model for that Air Force colonel under 21. Look at that. He looks like a college freshman. It's Mark Wayne. This guy did become a general officer and one of the giants of the business. He is remembered, matter of fact, in Barksdale. This from February 1943 was the Barksdale base paper, the Barksdale's Bark. I've told the folks out there not to go back to this name, all right? Keep what you got. But there it is, the men of Barksdale, Colonel Cecil Brick Lessig, a member of the 8th Air Force Staff. He won a gunnery competition while at Barksdale. He is credited with being the first Army Air Force officer to fly over German-occupied Europe in 1942 in the cockpit of a British Spitfire. And he led the raid on Amiens that was a diversion during the Dieppe raid. And there he is in his retirement photo as a brigadier general. Now this guy, I told you we'd get back to him. By the way, he and my grandfather both knew Mitchell. All these men worked at one time or another for Doolittle or Arnold and LeMay. He got quite famous as this guy, the architect of the over-the-hump cargo effort that resupplied China during World War II, and the architect of the Berlin airlift, and here he is on the cover of Time magazine from 1950, General William Tunner. Well, remember this guy? Well, when he got together with her right there under the boss's nose, they decided they'd make a go of it, and sure enough, they produced this guy. Bobby Madison wanted me to put in a plug for scouting, so there it is, Bobby. There it is from the Cub Scout class of 1958 at Barksdale Air Force Base, Alabama. That would be my first blue uniform up there in that upper left-hand corner. But now, before I take the entire 20th century history of the United States Air Force and reduce it to a bad plot line for Army wives, let me take you to my point. And it is this, that these 6 giants to me, literally giants, as I played on the kitchen floor, bound together by friendship and kinship, stayed in touch with one another through the some 5 decades that their services crossed in the mid-20th century. And of all of the children of that generation, only one military aviator was produced. As a matter of fact, only one child who had any interest in going into military aviation. And that would be me. So I became at a very young age the beneficiary of the mentoring from all of these people who, as I say, were literally giants to me. And they were all educated men, very smart men. They would get together as their paths crossed and particularly finding the concentrated inspiration and eloquence that's located in the bottom half of a bottle of good scotch. Now, I've noticed in this trend that there's much more eloquence and inspiration in the bottom half than the top half of the bottle of scotch. They would talk about their experiences. They would talk about air power history. They would talk about world history. They would talk about the challenges of the day. And it's just a little shaver. Before I ever even considered taking my first course in 20th century history, I could tell you about the bonus marchers during the 1930s. I could tell you about the War Department holiday, where they just closed down for the summer in the 1930s. Talk about sequestration. I knew about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the Condor Legions and the Spanish Civil War. I knew the difference between a Chamberlain and heard his name spat between clenched teeth, and a Churchill, and had heard his name toasted. And I also knew about something that they all called serial unpreparedness. The 2 oldest individuals, Tunner and Sams, Colonel Sams, were already young men when America entered the First World War, just a dozen years after America had invented the science of powered aviation. And yet they were, answer that for me, would you? I'm busy. They were quite aware when America entered the First World War that America had just in those dozen years, through neglect and indifference, squandered away its leadership in aviation, and not a single aircraft of American design saw frontline service during the First World War. They were acutely aware that this region's own military hero, Hoy Barksdale, after whom our base is named, didn't learn to fly in the United States. He was taught to fly by the British. And he saw his first combat action as an American attached to a Royal Flying Corps squadron in France, long before America was able to get its weight into the war. And they talked about serial unpreparedness and made me acutely aware of that and how that has been part of our history. They also made me aware of some things, and as a proud citizen of the Ark of the Text, I hold with great pride. But some things that are kind of uncomfortable make me squeam just talking about them. First, I think anybody at Barksdale recognized this patch of paper. You know it. 2nd Bomb Wing. He commanded 2nd Bomb Wing. Actually, that is the old 2nd Bomb Group. That was the core of a group put together by Billy Mitchell to demonstrate in the early 1920s the ability of air power to sink capital ships. Now, nobody who's been in the Air Force is allowed to answer this question. But who can tell me the name of the ship that Billy Mitchell sank off the Virginia Capes in 1921? Anybody? Well, that's you, Amy. The Ostfriedland. Yeah, the Ostfriedland. Billy Mitchell put together that air power demonstration with the 2nd Bomb Group, now the 2nd Bomb Wing at Barksdale, and the 96th Bomb Squadron, which General Cole also commanded in turn, also now at Barksdale. In 2004, General Deptula demonstrated in a firepower demonstration out in the Pacific the sinking of a capital ship with a precision-guided bomb. I don't think anybody would know the name of that ship, but let me try. Anybody aware of that? 2004, the first time a moving ship was sunk with a single precision-guided bomb. Well, it was the U.S. Navy ship Schenectady, and it was sunk with a 2,000-pound bomb dropped by this squadron, the 49th Test and Evaluation Squadron, and guess where they are? Right across the river, the little pea patch, Barksdale Air Force Base. And that's where that B-52 took off from. Payne already mentioned the 47th Fighter Squadron. Last year, the 47th Fighter Squadron, in an air power demonstration, sunk a Navy ship, a decommissioned Navy ship, called the Niagara Falls. They kind of pick on New York here for some reason. I'm not too sure I know why. But the Niagara Falls with gunfire only, with just the 30mm cannon from the A-10, and sunk it on one pass. And again, another demonstration of our great air power tied into Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana. But now one of the things that makes you a little squeamish, or at least me, anybody know the name of the first capital ship sunk in actual combat by land-based air power? Anybody ever hear of that? Well, it's something that makes our British friends particularly uncomfortable because they too have been guilty of serial unpreparedness, particularly under the leadership of the man I mentioned earlier, Neville Chamberlain. On December 10th, 1941, the pride of the British Navy, the HMS Prince of Wales, which only recently had participated in the action to sink the Bismarck, found itself at its moorings in Singapore as the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. Not wishing to be caught at anchor, the Prince of Wales steamed out into the open sea along with its escort ship, the Repulse. But the British, not having planned on having air cover in that theater of operations available to protect their ship, lost the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to land-based Japanese bombers on the 10th of December. But whatever our patch is, however we got started, kind of all goes back to this.
The Wright brothers were more than inspired tinkerers. They were visionaries and hard-headed businessmen. No sooner had they received the patent for their flying machine in 1906 than they headed for the deep pockets of the United States government.
Defense contractors are still heading there, by the way. It's a long tradition.
The Army organized an aeronautical division within the Signal Corps, operating both airplanes and lighter-than-air machines. Airfields were acquired. Pilot training began, much of it by Wilbur Wright himself. Lieutenant Frederick Humphrey soloed to become Army Pilot number 1. By 1911, there were 21 young officers in training.
Well, air power everywhere got off to a rough start. This is one of the ways it got off to a start in 1913 on Oahu. That rail there is in the backyard of the family whose daughters babysat for my kids out there. And one day the history office and I went out in their backyard and dug it up. General Graves, what are you doing here? Oh, just a little playing in the sand. And we had a number of great feats, navigation feat from two folks from here, finding their way to Hawaii in the 1920s. And here is Hugh Herndon and Clyde Pangborn with the Miss Beadall flying from Japan to Washington State if you notice, to lighten the load, they threw their boots overboard as soon as they took off. But there were a lot of dangers back then. This famous English aviator lost his life in the Indian Ocean in a thunderstorm. We all know about Wiley Post and Will Rogers, and who says Barksdale doesn't have a tie-in? If you can read that down there, Barksdale Field, that's addressed to Major John Ross, Barksdale Field, Louisiana. Amelia Earhart, we've all heard of her. And of course, in our own time, the Challenger disaster in the 1980s, and right here overhead Shreveport, the Columbia. This being the track from the Shreveport National Weather Service when the Columbia went down. You can see that streak of debris just south of town. The first lesson is that even when nobody's shooting at you and the weather seems benign, operations in aerospace are difficult, demanding, and potentially dangerous. And I love this quote from General Kinney, who was my father's commander in the Southwest Pacific. Weather is still our greatest enemy. They lost more airplanes to weather accidents than they did in combat. And of course, the crew of the space shuttle and President Reagan's eulogy. Well, I talked about that serial unpreparedness, and part of it is sort of a blind eye that we as Americans, a peace-loving people, turn to conflict. We don't want to be involved in it. We don't want to pay attention to it. And so we entertain ourselves with other things. I have an example of some of the entertainment. Here's Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. There's the beginning of the Miss America pageant. Of course, we had the World Series going on. President Roosevelt here opening the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And we got these folks. This, of course, is at a younger age our own Steve Aiken and Amy Gaucher. Those of you who do not buy your tickets to the opera don't know what you're missing. This is Fred Astaire and who is that? Eleanor Powell. Yeah, Eleanor Powell from 1940s Broadway Melodies. This was a repeat. They had a Broadway Melodies every year through the Depression. It kind of took people's minds off of what was going on. But let's review what was going on internationally while these were coming out. Well, let's see. Mussolini took over the government of Italy and declared his government to be absolute, a fascist government, claiming the symbol of ancient Roman imperial authority. He soon attacked independent countries in Africa, which brought down the League of Nations and the post-Great War world order that was supposed to prevent such things. In 1933, the same year Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in as President of the United States, Hitler assumed dictatorial powers in Germany. His first act was to dissolve the Reichstag, the parliament. Soon Hitler was rearming Germany. He reoccupied with German forces the Ruhr Valley and the Rhine. He marched into Austria in the Anschluss, and then partitioned Czechoslovakia. In September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, beginning the greatest conflict in human history, World War II. By the spring of 1940, France had fallen, along with all the other European powers in conflict with Hitler. Britain stood alone in the Atlantic. Japan was expanding throughout the Western Pacific, was beginning its third decade of occupation of Korea, had taken over most of eastern China, and in an impressive action to quelch civilian uprisings, Japan committed what history remembers as the rape of Nanking. In all this, it's hard to take your eyes off of it, but this is what America was paying attention to. And we all know that we paid a bitter price for our indifference. Yep, they bring it to a big finish, thanks Phil. Bring up that Cole Porter music. I love it. Yep, there's Steve and Amanda. All right. See him at the opera. All right. This is the price we pay. many of you saw the 2000-2001 potboiler Pearl Harbor? Anybody here see it? Okay, you know, I studied military history all of my life, and I always thought that I understood the real conflict in the Second World War. I realized after I saw this movie that I was laboring under misapprehension. The real conflict in the Second World War was not a clash of great geopolitical forces in the Atlantic and the Pacific Basins. The real conflict was which one of those two Army pilots was going to get that Navy nurse. Right? I mean, here I've been wrong all these years. Well, if you saw that movie, you'd probably think that those two pilots were fictional characters. They were, in fact, real people. They were Second Lieutenants Ken Taylor, here on the left, and George Welsh from, as General Cole said, the 47th, then called the Pursuit Squadron, now the 47th Fighter Squadron, spent 4 decades here at Barksdale, and I had the privilege of commanding that unit while it was there. They, in addition to their exploits at Pearl Harbor, they went on during the war to go forward to Iwo Jima before the island was fully occupied by the Marines. They assisted with close air support missions for the Marines, and then became the first Army Air Force fighters over Tokyo in April of 1945. This is the first commander of the 47th. He's standing there next to an airplane with a couple hundred gallons of aviation gasoline, a few hundred rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Anybody know what he's doing right there? Okay. He'd lighten up a Lucky. Yeah, there you go. Pretty smart. And this was my airplane. You'd see Lieutenant Colonel Jim Graves there under the canopy bow. That is part of our heritage, ladies and gentlemen, right here at Barksdale. And the second lesson, the requirement to be ever vigilant. Just as this plaque points out at the headquarters of Pacific Air Forces, the shrapnel and bullet holes were left as a silent symbol of the sacrifice of those who gave their lives. These walls also remind us of the need to remain ever vigilant in the defense of our nation and our way of life.
Doolittle and his crews took off not having landing sites ahead of them.
How about that full elastic stall just 50 feet above the water?
That after they bombed Japan, presuming they got away with that, after they flew across the Sea of Japan, after they reached the Chinese coast, they were on their own. All bets were off. And they were doing this against an absolutely remorseless foe.
The Doolittle Raiders sneaked through, achieved surprise, and made single-plane strikes that hit Tokyo and 4 other Japanese cities. Japanese defenses did not succeed in hitting a single plane. The material damage was a pinprick, but the damage to Japanese pride and disrupted war plans was huge. America wildly cheered the Doolittle heroes.
All right, you're going to see a trend here. Guess where the 17th Bomb Group, the core of the Doolittle Raiders, trained in their B-25s? Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, right here. Part of our heritage. Along with the heritage of 8th Fighter Command, represented by our own P-51 Mustang out at the airplane park. And along with that, the heritage of the mighty 8th Air Force and the B-17s. Let me see if I can get my technology to work here. And one other storied action in World War II, Operation Tidal Wave, August 1st, 1943, the Ploesti raid. Guess where the 98th Bomb Group and the members of the B-24 crews that flew that mission, where every single individual on the mission was decorated for heroism, and 5 medals of honor were awarded, more than any other single mission in American military history. They trained right here at Barksdale. And oh, by the way, we have the Louisiana Bell in our airplane park to recognize them. This gentleman, John R. Killer Kane was one of the recipients of the Medal of Honor for his leadership on that mission. He was the son of a Baptist preacher who for 21 years was the pastor of the Southside Baptist Church in a little town that some of you might have heard of, Shreveport, Louisiana. Yeah. Killer Kane played football for a little school just west of here, some of you might have heard of, Baylor. He came back to Shreveport after he graduated from Baylor, married a Shreveport girl, joined the Army Air Corps right here, trained at Barksdale. When the Ploesti Raiders, the 98th Bomb Group, in 2011 decided that they wanted to have a reunion, they had it right here at Barksdale. This, by the way, is the enlisted club at Barksdale, and the keynote speaker for that program, the gentleman who introduced me, Brigadier General Pate Cole. Right here at little old Barksdale. And what I consider to be the central lesson of air power can attack the enemy's center of gravity, bounding over its field and forces for decisive effect. And then a friendly little quote there from General Curtis E. LeMay. I'll let you read it for yourself. There he is, old Smiley, one of the architects of SAC, Peace is Our Profession, and an important part of the heritage of Barksdale. And by the way, the heritage of this great institution, Strategic Air Command, is now bound up in our own Air Force Global Strike Command, and also carries forward in the museum from events like Linebacker 2 that ended the war in Southeast Asia, commemorated last December under the leadership of our President, Mr. Terry Snook, with the 40th anniversary reunion of the participants of Linebacker 2 and the dedication of a memorial at Barksdale. We also had Operation Secret Squirrel, Crusaders Against Evil. And you may not know who they are, but those are the people who fired the opening shots of the Gulf War in 1991. They were 7 B-52 crews that took off from, you guessed it, Barksdale. And then an operation that took place in, was it 1994, General Cole? Wonder how I got that newspaper? The B-52s flew a 47-hour mission around the world, there with our own Brigadier General Pate Cole, member of the Downtown Rotary Club. You knew I'd get you. And who would forget September 11, 2001, when the President of the United States, after our nation was attacked for the first time since the War of 1812 by a foreign enemy, decided that he would set up his first command post right here at Barksdale. There's President Bush from the podium of the conference room at 8th Air Force Headquarters.
This is an Air Force report. Air power with global reach extending into space. This is the capability of the new Global Strike Command. Tech Sergeant Sabrina Horton reports.
The Air Force is standing up the new Global Strike Command. The Global Strike Command will merge the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Forces, currently with Air Force Space Command, and the bomber forces currently under Air Combat Command. Global Strike Command will continue the strategic deterrent role that its components are doing today. Bomber crews will also continue providing the warfighting capabilities they bring to combatant commanders.
Right here at Barksdale now with Air Force Global Strike Command. Ladies and gentlemen, right behind that sign that has Barksdale Air Force Base, Air Force Global Strike Command at the north gate of Barksdale, you'll find Barksdale's Global Power Museum. Please, come through that gate. I don't know why people find it so intimidating. Well, General Cole, I don't know about you, but every time I go to that gate, I get a snappy salute. The airman wishes me a nice day. I hope they're just as nice to you, but come through that gate and take a left right after you get through it, and you'll be at the Barksdale Global Power Museum, where I hope that you will be as inspired as I have, and as thousands of other visitors have been, by the heritage of our great United States Air Force, and particularly how it ties in right here at Barksdale. I want to, though, leave you with another thought. You know, having spent 37 years, but who's counting, in uniform, and living under the central of the Air Force's 3 core values, service before self, I can't help but notice the resemblance with this organization whose motto is service above self. We would have used the same thing, except in combat aviation, you never let anything get above you. The only thing we let have an altitude advantage on us is God, right? Okay. But the military is an organization filled with people who volunteer, who so love peace and so love freedom that they give up a great deal of their own peace and freedom to preserve the peace and freedom of others. This organization and others like it is filled with people that so love peace and fellowship and their fellow man that they give up a great deal of their time, and for Paul Harris Fellows and others, a great deal of their own fortune to assure the peace and the fellowship of their fellow man. Now, those of us who get together often sing patriotic songs, as we did with Tom Arsenault leading us today in a beautiful patriotic song. We've heard our national anthem here, and we hear our national anthem often at military events and at sporting events. And those of us who attend those sporting events wait in breathless anticipation of the last 2 words of the first verse of the national anthem. What are they? Play ball, right? Okay. But I want to leave you with a verse of the national anthem that has fallen somewhat into disuse. It is the 4th verse of that 4-verse poem that Francis Scott Key wrote when inspired by our flag going up over the ramparts at Fort McHenry after he expected to see it surrender. And it's a verse that he wrote for people like you, who so love peace and so love your fellow man, that you give up a great deal of your own time and your own fortune to help others. Just as the volunteers did who defended Fort McHenry, who inspired Key. Now, my wife doesn't even let me sing in the shower at home, and I could clear this building faster than a fire alarm if I sang it, so I'm going to give it to you by recitation, changing just a few words to fit current parlance. And it goes like this. So thus be it ever, when free people stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may this heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. So if conquer we must, as our cause it is just, let this be our motto: in God is our trust, that the star-spangled banner forever shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. My friends, on behalf of the Barksdale Global Power Museum Association, this whole museum piece of an airman salutes each and every one of you. God bless you in your continuing service to peace, freedom, and America, and my most fervent prayer, may God continue to bless America with more like you. Thank you very much for this time we've shared together.